Abigail Whitaker's hand closed around his wrist before she even knew she'd moved. The pen stopped 1 inch above the paper, and Silas Carver's smile died in the same breath. Nobody grabbed Nathaniel Reed's hand. Nobody in this county dared. But Abigail wasn't from this county. She was from a grave nobody had dug justice for yet. If this story made you hold your breath, you're already in it. Subscribe and follow this channel to the very end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 sat heavy over Virginia, the way only a southern summer can, the kind that presses down on your shoulders and makes every breath feel borrowed. Reed Hall had stood on its hill for 40 years, a white-columned house surrounded by tobacco fields, creek-fed pastures, and the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from isolation. Abigail Whitaker had lived inside that quiet for 11 months. She had arrived the previous August, 23 years old, carrying a travel bag and a letter of recommendation she had written herself. Her credentials were real. She had been educated at a Quaker school in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, could read Latin and figures, and had spent 2 years teaching the daughters of a merchant family in Philadelphia. But her reason for coming to Reed Hall had nothing to do with employment. She had come for her brother. Thomas Whitaker had been a clerk. A quiet, careful young man who kept his coat brushed and his records straight. He had worked for Silas B. Carver for 14 months before he started writing letters home that worried her. Small things at first, the kind of observations a young man makes when something at work sits wrong, but he can't name it yet. Then specific things. Numbers that repeated in columns where they shouldn't. Dates on land transfers that didn't match the courthouse filings. A signature on a deed that didn't belong to the man who was supposed to have signed it. Thomas had written to her in February of 1816. I believe Mr. Carver has been altering the Reed estate records for years. I don't know yet how deep it goes, but I'm going to find out. 6 weeks later, Thomas Whitaker was found face down in Harker's Creek, half a mile outside of town. The county called it an accident. Abigail had never believed that for a single day. She had spent 4 months after his death collecting everything she could. His letters, his copied notes, the partial ledger pages he had sent her for safekeeping before he died. Then she had done the only thing she could think to do. She had gone straight into the house where the fraud was happening and made herself invisible. Governesses were good at being invisible. People talked freely in front of them. Men with power especially. They spoke over governesses around them, through them, as though the women in the room were pieces of furniture that happened to be able to hear. Silas Carver was no different. In 11 months, Abigail had watched, listened, and cataloged. She had learned the rhythms of Reed Hall, when Carver arrived, how long he stayed, which rooms he used, which doors he never opened, which drawers he locked. She had memorized the estate ledger by reading it in pieces over 6 different mornings in the library before anyone else woke. She had found 2 documents she hadn't expected: a letter written in Nathaniel Reed's father's handwriting, and a land transfer dated 3 weeks before the elder Mr. Reed had died. She had been building a case the way her brother had tried to build one. More carefully, more quietly, with the understanding that if she moved too soon, she would end up the way Thomas had ended up. Then the morning of July 14th came, and everything moved faster than she had planned. She heard Carver arrive before she saw him. His boots on the front steps were distinctive, heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who had never in his life questioned his right to be somewhere. Abigail was on the second-floor landing when she heard the front door open and something in the sound of it. The hour, the fact that no visit had been scheduled, made her stop. She stood very still. Below her in the entrance hall, she heard Carver speaking to Henry, the house steward, in a low voice. She caught only fragments. Morning. Yes. The document. Today. Today. That one word landed in her chest like a stone. She moved to the top of the stairs without making a sound and looked down into the hallway. Carver was already heading toward the library, a leather satchel under his arm. His silver hair combed and his coat pressed as though he had dressed for an occasion. Abigail turned and went the back way. The library at Reed Hall ran along the east side of the house. It was Nathaniel Reed's room in every sense that mattered. His books, his father's desk, his collection of surveying maps from the years before the fever had taken most of his sight. He spent his mornings there because the east light came in strong and the shadows stayed consistent, and consistency was what allowed him to navigate a world he could no longer fully see. Nathaniel Reed had been 30 when the fever hit. It had come on fast-burned for 10 days and left him alive in a way that sometimes didn't feel entirely like a gift. His central vision had collapsed to blur and shadow. He could see shapes light color in broad strokes. He could not read. He could not identify a face across a room. He had learned to listen with a focus most people never developed, and he had learned to trust the voices of people around him in ways he now understood had made him dangerously dependent. He was standing beside the desk when Carver came in. "Nathaniel." Carver's voice was warm. It was always warm. 30 years of practice had made that warmth automatic. "Good morning. I hope I'm not disturbing you early." "Silas." Nathaniel turned toward the sound. "I wasn't expecting you today. I know, and I apologize for the short notice. But there's a time-sensitive matter with the Western farm leases. The Dunmore contract expires at the end of August, and if we don't file the management extension before the month's end, the county will step in and assign a temporary overseer. I've drafted the paperwork to prevent that. It's a simple extension. Just your signature." Nathaniel's hand found the back of the desk chair. He didn't sit. "Read it to me." "Of course." Carver opened the satchel, and the rustle of paper filled the room. "It grants temporary management authority over the western acreage to a designated legal representative, myself in this case, with the purpose of maintaining continuity of tenant contracts during the transition period. Standard language. Nothing you haven't seen before. My father never needed transition management paperwork. Your father could see the ledger, Nathaniel." The warmth in Carver's voice didn't shift, but something beneath it tightened for just a moment. "I don't say that to cause pain. I say it because the situation is different now, and the county has different requirements for an estate that operates under legal representation. This simply formalizes what's already true. It protects you." There was a pause. "All right," Nathaniel said. "Bring it to the desk." Abigail reached the library doorway at the exact moment Nathaniel's fingers found the pen. She had come through the servants' corridor and stopped just outside the door, and what she saw made her breath stop in her throat. Nathaniel was standing at the desk, his left hand flat on the paper to orient himself, his right hand lifting the pen. Carver stood to his left, close one hand hovering near Nathaniel's elbow as though to guide him to the signature line. And Abigail knew, because she had memorized that ledger, because she had read every document Carver had ever left in that room, because she had spent 11 months building the evidence her brother had died for exactly what that piece of paper said. It was not a temporary management extension. It was a permanent transfer of ownership. The Western farms, the mill leases, the tenant land agreements, the creek rights, and 400 acres of prime tobacco field, all of it signed over in perpetuity to a legal entity that existed for one purpose: to drain Reed Hall's value into Silas Carver's private accounts until there was nothing left to drain. Nathaniel's hand lowered. The pen moved toward the paper. Abigail crossed the room. She didn't plan it. She didn't announce it. She closed the distance in 6 steps. Her hand came up and she closed her fingers around Nathaniel Reed's wrist and stopped the pen 1 inch above the page. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathaniel went completely still. Not from fear, from the shock of an unexpected touch, the body's immediate recalibration when something impossible has just happened in a world it thought it understood. Carver turned. For 1 second, his face was unguarded. Then the mask came back harder than before. "What in God's name?" His voice came out sharp, the warmth gone entirely. "Who are you? Release him immediately." Abigail did not release him. She kept her hand around Nathaniel's wrist, and she looked directly at Carver, and she said in a voice she had been practicing inside her own chest for 11 months, "Mr. Reed, if you sign that paper by sunset, this house will no longer be yours." The pen clattered onto the desk. Nathaniel pulled his hand back. Not away from her, away from the paper. He straightened, his jaw set. The blurred world in front of him had gone completely silent, except for two voices, and he was deciding which one to listen to. "Get her out of this room," Carver said to the empty doorway, as though Henry might appear from nowhere. His voice was controlled again, but the control was costing him now. "This woman is a servant. She has no business in a legal proceeding." "She hasn't gone anywhere," Nathaniel said quietly. "And neither have I." He turned his head toward Abigail. He couldn't see her clearly, but he was facing her. "Who are you?" "Abigail Whitaker. I've been the governess here for 11 months, Mr. Reed. I teach your niece on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. We've spoken in this room twice, once in September, when I asked permission to use the Atlas shelf, and once in March, when you had me read a letter from your Philadelphia solicitor aloud, because your usual reader was ill." A pause. She watched him process that. "Miss Whitaker." He said her name carefully, the way a man says a name when he's cross-referencing it against memory. "You were the one who caught the error in the Caldwell letter." "Yes, sir." Another pause. Longer. Carver took a step toward the desk. "Nathaniel, this is an embarrassment. She's a governess. She's read something and misunderstood it, and now she's—" Silas. Nathaniel's voice was quiet but absolute. "You'll stop talking for a moment." The room went silent again. Nathaniel turned back toward Abigail. "Tell me what you believe the document says." Abigail picked up the paper from the desk. Her hands were steadier than she'd expected. She had imagined this moment in a dozen different versions over the past months, and in most of them her voice had shaken. But it didn't shake. It came out clear and level, the way it did when she read to the students in her classroom, matter-of-fact, precise, no performance. "Clause 1, she said. "Transfer of administrative authority. The document does not say temporary. It says permanent. The word is here in perpetuity, written into the third sentence of the first clause." Nathaniel said nothing. She continued. "Clause 2 covers the scope of transfer. It includes the western acreage, the Dunmore leases the mill contracts on the Harker tributary, and the creek water rights. Mr. Carver described this to you as a management extension for the western farms. But the document also transfers the mill contracts and the water rights, which Mr. Carver did not mention." She heard Carver draw breath to speak. "Clause 3, she said before he could. "This is the clause that matters most. It transfers signature authority. After you sign this document, Mr. Reed, any future legal actions regarding the properties listed in Clause 2 will require the co-signature of the designated legal representative, Mr. Carver, to be valid. You would not be able to modify, sell, lease, or reclaim any of those properties without his written agreement. That is not a management extension. That is a transfer of control." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel's hand had found the edge of the desk again. He was gripping it. "That's a lie," Carver said. His voice had gone flat. The warmth was completely gone now, and what replaced it was something older and harder. "That woman is misreading legal language she has no training to understand. Nathaniel, I have served your family for 30 years. I drew up your father's will. I managed this estate through his illness and his death. And now you're going to take the word of a governess over mine." "I haven't taken anyone's word yet," Nathaniel said. "I'm listening." "Then I suggest you stop listening to her and think about what you're doing. This document has to be filed by the end of the month. If you delay—" "Silas." The word came out harder this time, not loud, just final. "I said stop talking." Carver stopped. Nathaniel turned back toward Abigail. "Clause 3. Read it again, the exact words." Abigail found the line and read it. Word for word. No interpretation. Just the language Carver had written and hoped would never be read aloud. When she finished, the silence stretched for a long time. "Silas," Nathaniel said at last. His voice had changed. Something underneath it had changed the way a room changes when you understand what's been hidden in it. "The document you described to me and the document that was placed in front of me are not the same document." Carver said nothing. "That's a simple statement of fact," Nathaniel said. "I would like you to respond to it." "I described it accurately. You told me it was a temporary management extension. Miss Whitaker has read me language that says permanent. Those are opposite things, Silas. I don't need sight to know the difference between temporary and permanent. A long pause. There may have been a drafting error, Carver said. My clerk may have used incorrect language. I can have it corrected and return. No. Nathaniel straightened fully. You will leave this house. You will leave that document on this desk, and you will not return until I send for you. The silence that followed was different from the others. It had weight to it. And underneath the weight, something else, the particular sound of a man recalculating, rapidly deciding how much damage had already been done and how much could still be controlled. Nathaniel. Carver's voice had shifted again, softer now, almost wounded. I understand you're unsettled. That's natural. But think clearly. A governess with no legal background, no standing in this county, no connection to this family, has just interfered in a private legal matter. She has grabbed your hand. She has accused me of fraud in my own client's house. And you're dismissing me on her word. I'm dismissing you on the language of your own document, Nathaniel said. Miss Whitaker only read what was already written there. She may have read it incorrectly. Then I'll have it read by 3 more people. He turned his head toward Abigail again. Miss Whitaker, would you be willing to remain in this room while I send for my Philadelphia solicitor's proxy in Richmond? Abigail set the document back on the desk. Yes, Mr. Reed, I would. Carver crossed the room and picked up his satchel. You're making an error, he said. I hope when you've thought more clearly, you'll understand that. Maybe, Nathaniel said. But I'll make it with both eyes open. Carver left. The front door closed. In the library, the summer light came through the east windows and lay across the desk in long, patient strips. Abigail stood on the opposite side of the desk from Nathaniel Reed and watched him stand very still for a moment, the way a man stands when the world has just tilted and he is deciding whether to trust the new angle. Then he said, How long have you known what specifically, Mr. Reed? That Carver was defrauding this estate? Abigail was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have suspected it since before I arrived here. He turned toward her. Explain that. So she told him, not the short version, the full version. Her brother's name, his employment, his letters, his death, the ledger pages he had mailed her for safekeeping. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you tell a story when the truth of it is already dramatic enough without any help from the telling. Nathaniel stood at the desk and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Your brother's name was Thomas Whitaker, he said. Yes. I was told he drowned. That's what was said. Did you believe it? No. He put both hands flat on the desk the way he did when he was orienting himself without making it look like he needed to. Miss Whitaker, you came into my household under false pretenses. I came under accurate pretenses. I am a governess. I have functioned as a governess for 11 months. Your niece can conjugate Latin verbs and calculate compound interest, which she could not do before I arrived. I did not misrepresent my qualifications. You misrepresented your reason for being here. I did. Another long pause. She didn't fill it. Why are you telling me now? He asked. Why not months ago? You said you've known for months. Because I needed proof before I gave you a name to act on. Telling you Carver was a fraud without evidence would have accomplished nothing. He would have denied it, dismissed me, and I would have lost access to everything I'd found. Today was the first morning where I had enough documentation and where the moment was immediate enough that I didn't have the option of waiting. Nathaniel was quiet again. You took a considerable risk, he said at last. Yes, he could have had you removed from the county. He could have done worse things than that, she said. He's done worse things before. That landed. She watched his expression shift, not dramatically, not with theater, just the small adjustment of a man who has understood something new. What documentation do you have? He asked. My brother's copied ledger pages. 3 letters he wrote me before he died. A land transfer dated to 3 weeks before your father's death that carries a signature that does not match your father's hand in any of his other correspondence. And the estate ledger from this library, which I have partially memorized and can walk you through entry by entry." He was still for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You've been building a case." "Yes." "This whole time?" "Yes." He turned away from her and faced the windows. The morning light caught the edge of his jaw, and the gray that had come into his hair earlier than it should have the fever had done that too, along with everything else it had taken from him. "All right," he said at last. "Then we'll build the rest of it together." Outside Reed Hall on the road that curved down from the house toward town, Silas Carver's carriage moved at a measured pace. He was not panicking. He had been in difficult positions before. He had managed them. He would manage this one. But as the carriage wheels turned on the summer dry road and the tree line of Harker's Creek came into view on his left, Carver stared out the window and thought about the young woman standing in that library with the document in her hands, reading his language back to a blind man, as though she had every right in the world to be there. And he thought about a clerk named Thomas Whitaker, who had made the mistake of looking too closely at the wrong ledger. He had one significant advantage, he reminded himself. No one in this county was going to believe a governess over Silas Carver. Not yet. He intended to keep it that way. Nathaniel Reed did not sleep that night. Abigail knew because she didn't sleep either. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, she heard him moving through the hallway outside the library. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind a man makes when he's pacing. Not from restlessness, but from the weight of something he can't put down. She stayed in her room and listened until the footsteps stopped. In the morning, he sent Henry to find her before breakfast. She came to the library and found him already at the desk. Both hands flat on the surface, a posture she was beginning to understand, meant he was anchoring himself. The estate ledger was open in front of him, which was almost painful to see. The book was useless to him without someone to read it, and yet he'd pulled it out anyway, as though proximity to the truth was better than nothing. "Sit down," he said when he heard her come in. She sat. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Not Thomas. Before Thomas. How did Carver manage to do this for as long as he did?" Abigail folded her hands in her lap. "Because your father trusted him completely, and because the fraud didn't begin as fraud." Nathaniel looked up, or in her direction, the distinction mattering less and less to her the longer she spent in this house. "Explain that. Carver managed your father's legal affairs for 30 years honestly. The first irregularities I found in the ledger don't appear until about 6 years ago. At that point, your father's health was beginning to decline. He was traveling less, relying more heavily on Carver for routine decisions. Small things began to shift fees slightly higher than recorded payments to accounts that don't appear anywhere else in the estate. Records land survey, costs billed twice. Nothing large enough to notice individually. Only visible when you line them up. And Thomas found them. Thomas found them because he was meticulous. He kept a second record, his own personal ledger of every document he processed while working in Carver's office. He compared dates, signatures, amounts. When entries didn't match, he noted them. He mailed me those pages because he was starting to be afraid. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. How long did he work for Carver before he died? 14 months. And in 14 months, he built enough of a case to frighten a man like Carver into... He stopped. The word he didn't say was loud anyway. "Yes," Abigail said simply. Another long pause. The summer morning pressed against the windows. Outside, somewhere down the hill, she could hear the distant sound of the tenant farmers beginning their work. "Show me what you have," he said. She had kept Thomas's documents in an oilskin pouch sewn into the lining of her second travel bag, the one she kept at the back of her wardrobe under a folded quilt. She retrieved them that morning and brought them to the library and read each one aloud while Nathaniel listened. He asked questions, good ones. He caught inconsistencies she hadn't noticed and asked her to reread sections until the picture sharpened. He had the kind of mind that organized information quickly categorized it without needing to write it down, and held multiple contradictions in suspension until the pattern emerged. Whatever the fever had taken from him, it hadn't touched that. By mid-morning, they had established 3 things with reasonable certainty. First, Carver had been systematically overcharging the estate on legal and management fees for at least 5 years, funneling the excess to shell accounts in his nephew's name in Richmond. Second, 2 land transfers from 4 years ago, both recorded as sales to outside parties, were almost certainly forged. The signatures didn't match Nathaniel's father's known handwriting, and the sales prices were significantly below market value for the time and location. Third, the document Carver had placed in front of Nathaniel the previous morning was not a drafting error. The language was too precise, too intentional, too carefully constructed to be accidental. "He needed my signature," Nathaniel said when she finished laying it out. "If he already has the shell accounts, if he's already moved money out, why does he need my signature on a transfer document now?" Abigail had thought about this. "Because the creek rights are still yours, and so are the mill leases on the Harker tributary. Those can't be transferred without your direct signature. Your father wrote that protection into the original estate charter. Carver has been working around it for years, but the charter provision means he can't actually complete the transfer of the mills without a document you sign willingly. So everything he's taken so far is manageable. But the mills are worth more than everything else combined," she said. "If grain processing along the Harker tributary goes to him, it goes to him permanently. Every farmer on this side of the county depends on that mill access. If Carver controls the contracts, he controls who farms, who sells, who stays, and who loses their land." The weight of that settled over the room. Nathaniel sat back in the chair. He said very quietly, "My father built those mills." "I know. He built them because when he was a young man, there was no grinding capacity within 20 miles, and families were losing crops they couldn't process in time. He spent 3 years and most of his savings building them, and then charged below market rates because he said the land was only worth what the people working it could produce." Abigail didn't say anything. She let him have the silence. "Carver stood at my father's funeral and said he'd been the finest man he'd ever known," Nathaniel said. "Yes." "He said that at the funeral." "I know." Another long pause. "How much does he know that you know?" Nathaniel asked. "Yesterday morning he knew nothing. By yesterday afternoon—" She stopped. "I don't know what he knows by now." She found out 2 hours later when one of the kitchen girls knocked on the library door and said there was a man at the servants' entrance who wanted to speak to Miss Whitaker privately. Abigail went to the back hallway and opened the door. The man outside was not someone she recognized. He was young, maybe 19, wearing a laborer's coat, and he looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. He held out a folded note and said, "Mr. Carver sends his regards." Then he left. She unfolded the note. It was brief, written in a clean, practiced hand. It said, "Miss Whitaker, I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to discuss the situation privately at your convenience before it becomes something neither of us can manage. I am, as always, a man who prefers resolution over conflict. S.B.C." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to the library. She handed it to Nathaniel without comment. He held it, not reading it, just holding it, and she realized what she'd done and said, "I'm sorry. I'll read it to you." She read it. He listened without expression. "He's not panicking," Nathaniel said when she finished. "He's recalibrating." "That's what I think too. A panicked man doesn't send a note that says at your convenience. He's deciding how much you know and whether he can still manage you. Can he?" The question came out before she fully intended it to, and she heard how it sounded direct, almost challenging. She didn't take it back. Nathaniel almost smiled. "No," he said. "He cannot." He set the note on the desk. "Don't respond. Don't acknowledge it at all. The moment you engage him privately, he has a version of that conversation he can present to other people. Let him wonder." Abigail nodded, then remembered he couldn't see it. Understood. How many people in town know you came here as Thomas's sister? None. I used my real name because I had nothing to hide about my identity. But I never told anyone in this county that Thomas and I were related. Carver may have already connected it. Our surname isn't common, and Thomas worked for him for over a year, but if he hasn't acted on it publicly yet. He will, Nathaniel said. When he does, the story will be that you came to Reed Hall with a personal vendetta and manipulated a blind man. That's the shape of the narrative he'll use. He said it without self-pity, which she found more troubling than if he'd said it with bitterness. He was simply mapping the landscape of the problem they were standing in the middle of, and one of the features of that landscape was that his blindness was going to be used as a weapon against him. Then we need to move faster than he does, she said. Yes, what do you need? The estate charter your father wrote. The original, not a copy. Fireproof box in the floor safe. Henry has the key. He paused. What else? Access to your father's personal correspondence, not the business letters, the private ones. A beat of silence. Those are in the bedroom, the trunk at the foot of the bed. He said it evenly, but she heard what it cost him. I'll be careful with them, she said. I know you will. He stood up from the desk. I'll tell Henry you have full access to this house. The next 3 days moved with a particular rhythm that Abigail would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not the rhythm of crisis, but something steadier and stranger. The rhythm of two people learning to work together in a space where trust hadn't fully arrived yet, but was building itself brick by careful brick out of shared necessity. She read. He listened and remembered. She found. He contextualized. She asked questions she didn't know the answers to. He supplied details from conversations and meetings she couldn't have known about, things his father had said, things Carver had said in rooms where Nathaniel had been present, but quiet, the kind of background information that turned isolated evidence into a coherent picture. His memory was extraordinary, not just reliable, precise. He could recall the exact phrasing of conversations from 4 years ago, the specific dates of meetings, the names of men who had been present in rooms that nobody else had thought to document. On the second evening, she made an observation out loud without thinking, which was something she was doing more frequently in his presence. She said, "You remember everything." "I remember everything I hear," he said. "I've always had a good ear. After the fever, I think I started listening more deliberately." He paused. "Compensation, I suppose." "It's more than compensation," she said. "Most people with full sight don't remember conversations the way you do." A beat of silence. "Is that a compliment, Miss Whitaker?" "It's an observation." He turned back toward the desk. "In that case, the land survey from 1812 that you found in my father's correspondence. Read me the surveyor's name again." She read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That man is dead. He died in 1814, and yet Carver billed for a survey from that name in 1815. The room went very still. She pulled the billing ledger, found the entry. He was right. A survey fee paid to a surveyor whose name appeared in the county death records 18 months before the payment had been made. "He billed a dead man," she said. "He forged a dead man's work," Nathaniel said. "Which means there's no land survey. Which means the acreage listed in the 1815 property transfer may not match what actually transferred." She stared at the ledger page and felt the case reshaping itself around them, larger and more solid than it had been 20 minutes ago. "This is enough," she said. "This alone, this is enough to take to a judge." "Not a county judge," he said immediately. "Carver has had 30 years to cultivate relationships with every sitting judge within 2 counties. We need someone outside his reach. Do you know anyone like that?" A long pause. "My father had a friend," Nathaniel said slowly. "A federal judge from Philadelphia, Elias Monroe. They served together on a land commission in 1804. He's retired from active practice but still holds federal standing. He came to my father's funeral." He stopped. "He came to my father's funeral, and Carver was there, and Monroe barely looked at him. I remember noticing it at the time. They didn't get along. They were civil. The way two men are civil when they fundamentally distrust each other but have no open cause for conflict. Abigail felt something shift. Could you contact him? I can write a letter today? Through your usual post. He understood immediately. No, Henry's brother runs a freight operation out of Charlottesville, not connected to this county's post office or Carver's network. I'll use that. The letter went out the next morning. Carver's second message arrived the same afternoon. This one was not delivered to the servant's entrance. This one came in the form of a formal visit not from Carver himself, but from a county sheriff's deputy named Dale Pruitt, who arrived at the front door of Reed Hall and asked to speak with Nathaniel Reed about a complaint that had been filed. Henry brought the news to the library. Nathaniel's expression didn't change. Tell him I'll see him in the front sitting room. Abigail stayed in the library and listened through the open door. Dale Pruitt was a soft-spoken man who clearly found the task he'd been given uncomfortable. He explained with several apologies that a formal complaint had been filed with the county courthouse alleging that a member of the Reed Hall household had come into unauthorized possession of private legal documents belonging to Silas B. Carver and Associates. A pause. Which documents? Nathaniel asked. Pruitt read a description from the paper he was holding. The description matched Thomas's ledger pages. Abigail's jaw tightened. The documents Mr. Pruitt is describing, Nathaniel said, are copies of estate ledger entries made by a clerk in Mr. Carver's employment. They concern the Reed estate. They are therefore in any reasonable interpretation documents to which I have a legitimate claim. Mr. Carver is prepared to contest that interpretation in court, sir. Then I look forward to contesting it, Nathaniel said. Is there anything else? A long pause. There is also, Pruitt said more quietly now, a question about a Miss Abigail Whitaker currently employed in your household. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. What about her? Nathaniel asked. Mr. Carver has alleged that Miss Whitaker entered Reed Hall under false pretenses, has been in unauthorized access of estate and legal records, and I'm reading this as it's written. Mr. Reed, these are not my words, has been exercising undue influence over a man of diminished capacity in order to serve her own personal interests. Inside the library, Abigail heard her own pulse. I see, Nathaniel said. His voice was completely level. Not tight, not cold. Level. Let me make certain I understand the claim correctly. Mr. Carver's position is that a governess with no legal standing, no financial stake in this estate, and no family connection to this county has somehow gained undue influence over me. That is the claim, sir. Yes. And what would Mr. Carver suggest the nature of her personal interest to be? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He suggests she may be operating on behalf of a third party, seeking to destabilize estate management and create grounds for a legal contest. On behalf of whom? He doesn't name a party. Of course not. Another pause. Mr. Pruitt, you have known me for how long? Going on 9 years, Mr. Reed. In 9 years have I struck you as the sort of man who could be easily influenced. A beat of silence that felt even from the next room like a man choosing his words with some care. No, sir, I would not say so. Then I would like you to go back to Mr. Carver and tell him that I received his complaint. I noted it, and I intend to have my own solicitor respond to it formally within the week. He paused. And Mr. Pruitt, the next time Mr. Carver asks you to deliver a message to my front door, you are under no obligation to do it. Pruitt left 10 minutes later. Henry came back to the library. Should I close the front gate, Mr. Reed? Yes, Nathaniel said. And I want to know immediately if anyone approaches the house. Anyone. That evening after supper, Abigail found him on the back porch. She almost didn't interrupt. He was standing at the rail facing out over the fields toward the line of trees where the creek ran, and there was something in his posture that said he was not looking for company. But he heard her step and said without turning, Miss Whitaker. She stopped. I can leave you in peace, Mr. Reed. No. A pause. Stay. She came and stood beside him a careful distance away, and they were both quiet for a while. The summer evening was thick and warm, and somewhere in the distance a whippoorwill was doing its one relentless thing. "He's moving faster than I expected," Nathaniel said. "He's frightened." "Yes, but frightened men with resources are more dangerous than confident men with nothing to lose." He paused. "The story he's telling the blind man and the manipulative governess, it will find an audience. This county has known me as a capable man, and known Carver as a respectable one. The narrative he's offering is easier to believe than the alternative. The alternative being that a man they've trusted for 30 years has been stealing from them." "Yes." She turned that over. "What do we do?" "We stop defending ourselves," he said, "and we start building something he can't dismantle." He turned slightly toward her. "The ledger from 1815. The dead surveyor. I want that cross-referenced with every property transfer Carver filed in this county in the last 6 years. If there's one forged survey, there are others." "That's a significant amount of work." "Yes, I can do it," she said. "But I'll need access to the county tax records, and I can't get those from inside this house." A pause. "There's a woman in town, Martha Coalfield. She's the widow of the county tax assessor. When her husband died, she kept his records because nobody bothered to ask for them back. She helped my father once with a property dispute years ago." He stopped. "She won't like Carver. Tax assessors rarely do." "Can you reach her without Carver knowing?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her grandson does deliveries for Henry's brother in Charlottesville." It was the first time Abigail almost smiled since the morning Carver had walked through the front door. "You know your county," she said. "I know my people," he corrected. And there was something in the way he said it, quiet, absolute, the way a man speaks about something that belongs to him, not by ownership, but by care, that settled something in her chest she hadn't known was unsettled. She looked out over the dark fields. "My brother used to say," she told him, "that the truth was always there. It just needed one person who was willing to look at it without flinching." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Thomas sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was the best man I knew," she said, "and he deserved better than what happened to him." A long pause. "So did my father," Nathaniel said. The whippoorwill called again in the dark. The fields lay still and quiet, full of sleeping crops and tenant families who didn't yet know that the man managing their contracts had been working for years to transfer everything they depended on into his own hands. And in the library behind them, on Nathaniel Reed's father's desk, lay a growing stack of documents that were slowly, carefully building the kind of case that couldn't be ignored, not by a county judge, not by a local sheriff's deputy, and not when Judge Elias Monroe of Philadelphia finally received his letter by the law itself. But Silas Carver had been managing powerful men's affairs for 30 years, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, he had already made his next move. Tipite. The move came in the form of 3 men who arrived at the edge of the property at dawn and began asking questions of the field workers. Not aggressive questions, not threatening ones, just the kind of slow, friendly neighbor-to-neighbor conversation that sounds like nothing at all, unless you understand what it's building. One of the tenant farmers, a steady man named Gus Holloway, who had farmed the southern fields for 11 years, came to the house before breakfast and asked to speak to Nathaniel directly. Nathaniel saw him in the library. "Mr. Reed." Gus said, hat in hand, standing in the doorway the way men stood when they were deciding between loyalty and fear. "I want you to know I haven't spoken to those men, and I won't. But I think you ought to know they're out there, and I think you ought to know what they're asking." "Tell me," Nathaniel said. Gus told him. The men had been asking whether Nathaniel was well, whether he was managing the estate properly since the fever, whether the governess had taken on responsibilities that seemed unusual for her position, whether any of the house staff had noticed changes in the way decisions were made at Reed Hall. They were building the foundation for a legal incompetency claim. Abigail understood it the moment Gus finished speaking. Carver wasn't just going to call her a manipulative outsider. He was going to argue that Nathaniel Reed, partially blind, possibly impaired by the lingering effects of the fever, was no longer capable of managing his own estate, and that a court-appointed guardian should take over, and that guardian, by some remarkable coincidence, would almost certainly be Silas B. Carver. She looked at Nathaniel. He was already looking in her direction. "How long do we have?" he asked her quietly. "Before he files a week. Maybe 2 if Monroe responds quickly and we can establish a competing legal presence before Carver can get his petition in front of a sympathetic judge." Nathaniel turned back to Gus Holloway. "Go back to your farm," he said. "Work your fields. Do not speak to those men, and if they come onto your property, you tell them to leave. And Gus..." Gus stopped at the door. "Thank you," Nathaniel said. "Your family has worked this land for 11 years. That will not change." Gus nodded. Something in his expression, the exact boundary where relief crossed into something more like quiet determination, told Abigail that whatever happened in this county in the weeks to come, there were people on the right side of it who would stay there. She sat down across from Nathaniel at the desk. "We need Monroe," she said. "Yes, and we need the courthouse records before Carver realizes what we're looking for." "Yes." She met his eyes, or the clouded, searching gaze that she had stopped thinking of as impaired and started thinking of simply as his. "How fast can Henry's brother move?" Nathaniel Reed put his hands flat on the desk. "Fast enough," he said. Henry's brother moved fast. By Thursday morning, a packet of letters had gone out through the Charlottesville freight route, one to Judge Elias Monroe in Philadelphia, one to a land records clerk in Richmond that Nathaniel had dealt with twice before and trusted, and one to a solicitor named Hargrove who had handled the Reed estate's federal filings before the fever had made travel impossible for Nathaniel. By Thursday afternoon, Carver had filed a petition with the county court. Henry brought the news. He stood in the library doorway with his hat in both hands and said quietly that he'd heard it from the blacksmith, who'd heard it from the courthouse clerk, who'd heard it directly from Carver's own office that morning. The petition alleged that Nathaniel Hawthorne Reed, due to the lasting physical and cognitive effects of his 1815 fever, was no longer capable of managing the affairs of Reed Hall without oversight, and requested that the court appoint a legal guardian to assume administrative authority over the estate until such time as Reed's competency could be formally established. The proposed guardian was Silas B. Carver. Nathaniel listened to the whole thing without moving. When Henry finished, Nathaniel said, "When is the hearing?" "10 days, sir. Judge Alderton is presiding." Abigail looked up from the ledger pages she was cross-referencing. Alderton. She had heard that name twice in the past week, once in a conversation Carver had with a visitor in the front hallway before she'd shut him out, and once in her brother's letters. Thomas had written Carver lunches with Alderton on the second Tuesday of every month. "I don't know what they discuss, but it is regular enough to mean something." "Alderton won't be fair," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "He won't." Henry was still standing in the doorway. "What do you want me to tell the staff, Mr. Reed?" "Tell them nothing has changed. Tell them to do their work and not speak to strangers about anything that happens in this house." He paused. "And Henry, is your loyalty to this household clear in your own mind?" Henry straightened. He was a man of 60 who had started at Reed Hall as a boy of 12, and the question plainly asked seemed to both surprise and settle him. "As clear as it's ever been, sir." "Good. Then go back to your work." Ahmed. The moment Henry left, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. No raised voices, no sudden movement. Just the quiet recalibration of two people who had just understood that the margin of time they were working within had collapsed from weeks to days. 10 days, Abigail said. Yes. Monroe can't get here in 10 days. Not by normal route. Nathaniel was already thinking past the problem. She could see it, the particular stillness he went into when he was moving fast inside his own head, the way the rest of him went quiet so his mind could run. But he doesn't need to be here for the hearing. He needs to send something before the hearing. A letter, a formal legal objection, anything that establishes federal interest in the case before Alderton can close the record. Can he do that from Philadelphia in 10 days? If he received our letter by yesterday, yes. Monroe is efficient. He was known for it. He paused. The question is whether he believes us. Abigail set down the ledger page she was holding. He knew your father. He knew my father as an honest man. Whether he extends that trust to me is a different question. Your letter was specific. You listed the documents, the forged survey, the dead surveyor's name, the billing discrepancies. She leaned forward slightly. A man like Monroe doesn't need you to be his old friend's son. He needs a credible case. We gave him one. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You sound very certain. I'm not certain at all, she said. But I've found that acting certain when you're not is sometimes the only way to keep moving. For the first time since she'd met him, Nathaniel Reed almost laughed. Not fully, it didn't make it all the way to his face, but something in his expression shifted, brief and genuine, before the weight of the situation closed back over it. All right, he said. What do we still need? Martha Caulfield's records. If her husband kept the original tax assessments from 1813 through 1816, I can compare them against Carver's billing ledger and prove the double charges. She paused. And I need to go get them myself. I can't send someone else. He was quiet for a moment. Carver has men watching the road. I know. Going into town right now after his petition, the story he's building will use that. A governess seen going through county records. He'll call it evidence of conspiracy. I know that too. She met his gaze steadily. But without those records, we walk into that hearing with a partial case. Alderton will dismiss everything we have as the personal grievance of a servant girl. The forged survey is strong, but it's one piece. 3 forged surveys with matching tax records is a pattern. A pattern is evidence even Alderton can't ignore publicly without exposing himself. A long pause. Take the South Road, Nathaniel said. Not the main one. And take Henry's wife's sister. She does washing in town on Thursdays. Go as company, not as an errand. Abigail nodded. If I'm not back by noon. You'll be back by noon, he said. Not because he was certain. Because he needed to say it. She understood the difference. Martha Caulfield lived in a small house behind the Baptist church, and she was exactly the kind of woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated by men like Silas Carver. She was 71 years old, sharp-eyed, slightly deaf in her right ear, and she opened the door before Abigail knocked because she had been watching from the window since the South Road came into view. You're the Reed governess, she said. Yes, ma'am. Henry's boy told me you might come. She stepped back to let Abigail inside. I was wondering when someone from that house was finally going to come looking for what my husband left. Abigail stopped just inside the door. You knew. Martha Caulfield gave her the look of a woman who had been waiting a long time to give someone exactly that look. Miss Whitaker, my husband filed complaints about Carver's billing practices 3 times in his last 4 years as assessor. He was told twice that the discrepancies were accounting errors, and the 3rd time he was told that continuing to raise the issue would reflect poorly on the integrity of his office. She moved to a back room and returned carrying a large wooden crate. When he died, I kept everything. Every record, every complaint, every note he made, because I knew that someday somebody would need it. Abigail looked at the crate, then up at Martha Caulfield. How long ago did your husband die? 7 years ago, April. 7 years. 7 years, Martha Caulfield had been sitting in this house behind the Baptist church with a crate of evidence that could have changed everything, waiting for someone to come ask for it. Her throat tightened. I'm sorry no one came sooner. Martha set the crate on the table. You're here now, she said. That's enough. Start reading. The records in that crate were better than Abigail had hoped. Not just the billing discrepancies, though, those were there, meticulously documented in the late assessor's careful handwriting. More than that, there were notes from conversations, records of meetings, a detailed account of the 3rd complaint, and the name of the county official who had told him to drop it. There was also a hand-drawn chart dated 1814 showing the assessed value of 6 properties and the recorded sale prices in Carver's filings, and the gap between the two columns was not small. Abigail worked through the crate as fast as she could. She didn't take the originals, she copied what she needed in her own hand quickly, with Martha watching over her shoulder and occasionally pointing to entries she thought were particularly significant. "That one," Martha said, tapping a page. "That's the Dunmore land. My husband flagged it twice." Abigail looked at the entry. A property assessment from 1813 valuing the Dunmore acreage at nearly $4,000. And then a filed sale record from Carver's office dated a year later, recording the same land sold for $900. "Who bought it?" she asked. "Look at the name." She looked. The buyer was a land holding company registered in Richmond. The company's registered agent, listed on a separate county document Martha pulled from the bottom of the crate, was Carver's nephew. Abigail sat back. "He sold the Reeds' land," she said, "to his own nephew, at a quarter of its value, and kept the difference. And then the nephew's company leased it back to the same tenant families who had been farming it," Martha said, "at higher rates than they'd paid before. And those families thought the lease rate increase was just the market because nobody told them the land had changed hands." Abigail thought about Gus Holloway standing in Nathaniel's library doorway, with his hat in both hands. About the fields she'd been hearing at work every morning through the library windows. About tenant families who had been paying the wrong man for years without knowing it. "I need to take these copies back to Reed Hall," she said. "I know. Go." Martha started gathering the original documents back into the crate. Then she stopped and looked at Abigail. "That young man up at the hall, Nathaniel Reed, is he going to be all right?" "Yes," Abigail said. "He is. His father was a good man." "I know. Carver used to say the same thing, at every dinner, every civic meeting, every funeral." Martha's voice was flat and precise. "The ones who say it loudest usually have the most reason to hide it." Abigail picked up her copied pages and folded them carefully into her coat. "Mrs. Caulfield," she said, "would you be willing to speak to a federal judge if it came to that?" Martha Caulfield looked at her for one long, quiet moment. "I've been willing to speak to a federal judge for 7 years, she said. Nobody asked. Cool. Abigail was back at Reed Hall by 11. Nathaniel was waiting in the library, not pacing, not restless, just standing at the desk in the posture she'd come to read as controlled tension, both hands on the surface facing the door, as though he could hear the road from there. She came in and put the copied pages on the desk and told him what she'd found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the clock on the mantel and the sound of someone working in the kitchen below. "He sold the Dunmore land to his nephew," Nathaniel said. The words came out very controlled, each one separate. "The land my father signed over to tenant protection." "Yes. And the families have been paying the nephew's holding company for 3 years." "Yes. Without knowing the land had been stolen from under them." "Yes." He turned away from her toward the windows. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she let him have it, the particular anger of a man who has just understood the full shape of a betrayal that he should have been able to prevent. Then he turned back. "What do we need to do today?" he asked. That was Nathaniel Reed. That was who he was. She filed it away that moment in the part of her that was quietly building a picture of a man that had nothing to do with evidence or legal strategy. "Today," she said, "we write a second letter to Monroe. We include what we found this morning, the Dunmore land transfer, the company registration, the nephew's name. And we write a formal letter to Hargrove in Richmond, requesting that he appear at the Alderton hearing as your legal representative. Alderton will try to disqualify him. Probably. But having a solicitor present, a named credentialed solicitor, changes the public record of the hearing. It makes it harder for Alderton to present whatever verdict Carver has already agreed to as a straightforward legal proceeding." Nathaniel was already moving to the desk. "Draft the Monroe letter. I'll dictate the Hargrove letter and you write it." They worked through the afternoon. 4 days before the hearing, Carver made a move none of them had anticipated. He didn't come to the house. He didn't send a deputy. He went to the church. Sunday morning, while Nathaniel's household attended service, Abigail stayed behind, technically because she had a headache, which she did not. Carver arrived early to the Methodist congregation, where half the county's landowners and merchants attended, and he spoke privately with Pastor Graves before the service. And during the announcements at the end of the service, Pastor Graves mentioned gently with what sounded like genuine pastoral concern that in times of difficulty, the community ought to hold one another up, and that when a man faced challenges that affected his capacity to manage the responsibilities given to him, it was not weakness, but wisdom to accept help. Nobody said Nathaniel Reed's name. Nobody needed to. When Henry came back from church and reported what had been said, Nathaniel sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "He's poisoning the jury pool." "There's no jury," Abigail said. "There's the public, which is what Alderton reads." He paused. "The hearing is in 4 days, and Carver just told the entire county that I'm a charity case who needs managing. By Tuesday, that story will have traveled to every farm and merchant within 15 miles. It won't matter if Monroe's letter arrives first. It won't matter if people believe the letter is real," he said. "A letter from Philadelphia is easy to dismiss as something a desperate man manufactured, especially when the county's most respected attorney has just spent 30 years establishing his credibility and 4 days establishing mine as a question mark." Abigail set down her pen. "Then we don't wait for Monroe's letter," she said. "We invite him to come himself." Nathaniel turned toward her. "I said 10 days. I know what you said, but Monroe is a federal judge, even retired. If he presents himself in that courtroom in person, Alderton cannot proceed without acknowledging his presence. And if he acknowledges Monroe's presence, the hearing becomes federal business." She paused. "Write him a third letter. Tell him what Carver did at the church. Tell him the hearing is in 4 days. And tell him that if a retired federal judge of his standing cannot find his way from Philadelphia to Virginia in 4 days for the protection of an innocent man's estate, then we will proceed without him and accept whatever verdict Alderton delivers." A long pause. "That's a gamble," Nathaniel said. "Everything we've done in the last week has been a gamble." He was quiet for a moment. Then very carefully he said, "You don't run from much, do you, Miss Whitaker?" "I ran for long enough," she said. "I spent 11 months being careful and quiet and invisible. And in the meantime, your father's land got sold to Carver's nephew, and my brother ended up in Harker's Creek." She picked up the pen again. "I'm done being quiet." Something in his expression shifted. Something that wasn't quite admiration, or wasn't only admiration, and that she made herself not look at directly, because they had 4 days and a hearing to survive before she had the right to think about anything else. "Third letter," he said. "Write it." The letter went out Monday morning. Monday afternoon, 2 things happened within an hour of each other. The first was that Hargrove's reply arrived from Richmond. Brief, professional, and clear. He would be present at the hearing. He had reviewed the preliminary documents they'd sent, and he believed they had a defensible case. He added one line that Abigail read 3 times. "The petition Carver has filed exposes him to counter-litigation if his claims are shown to be without merit." He may not have thought that through. The second thing that happened was that Abigail went to her room to retrieve a second copy of Thomas's ledger pages and found that her room had been searched, not ransacked, not violently disturbed, searched with the careful professional thoroughness of someone who knew what they were looking for and didn't want the search to be obvious. But the travel bag had been moved, not far, not enough that anyone in a hurry would notice, but she knew exactly where she had left it, and it was 2 inches from that place. The quilt it was hidden under had been refolded with the wrong edge facing out. Her correspondence bundle had been retied with the knot in a different direction. She stood in the center of her room and breathed slowly. Then she went to check the oilskin pouch. It was gone. She made herself walk, not run to the library. Nathaniel heard her come in, and something in her footsteps told him immediately that the situation had changed. He was already straightening from the desk before she spoke. "My room was searched," she said. Thomas's original ledger pages are gone. The silence was immediate and absolute. Then Nathaniel said, "When?" "During church yesterday, while the household was out." She paused. "The copies I made are still here. I moved them into your desk drawer on Friday." He didn't find those. But the originals... "The originals were Thomas's handwriting," Nathaniel said. "If Carver has them, he can destroy them. And then when we reference them at the hearing, there's no physical document to produce. Just your word." "Yes." "And against Carver's word in Alderton's court, my word is worth nothing," she said. "I know." Nathaniel stood up from the desk. For a moment, he simply stood, and she could see him working through it, not panicking, not raging, just moving through the problem with the focused precision that was becoming one of the most recognizable things about him. "The copies," he said. "Are they in the same handwriting?" "No, mine." "Then he doesn't know they exist." A pause. "What else do we have in my handwriting or my father's, something we could anchor the copies to?" Abigail thought fast. "Your father's final letter. The one warning about Carver altering the accounts. That's his handwriting. It's dated, and it's been in your possession since before any of this began. If I can cross-reference the entries Thomas copied against that letter, it's not enough alone. But combined with Martha Caulfield's records..." "Martha Caulfield is a living witness," Abigail said. "A 71-year-old widow whose husband filed formal complaints. Carver can dismiss documents. He cannot dismiss a woman who stands in court and tells a judge that her husband was silenced." Nathaniel turned toward her. "She said she was willing," Abigail said. "I asked her directly." He was quiet for one long moment. "We're going into that hearing with copies a dead man's letter, a widow's testimony, and a solicitor from Richmond. And the Dunmore land transfer with Carver's nephew's name on it," she said, "which is a county courthouse record. He can't destroy that it's been filed. He could argue it was a legitimate transaction. At a quarter of the assessed value to his own family member." She shook her head. "The number is the argument. You don't have to prove intent when the price is that far below market. Any honest judge sees that and asks a question. Alderton is not an honest judge." "No, but Monroe will be in that room." A pause. "We don't know that yet. We will by Thursday." He stood still for a long moment. Then he moved around the desk slowly and stopped about 3 feet from where she was standing. He was facing her directly the way he did when he wanted to speak to her rather than to the room. And she had learned by now that when he did that, it meant the words that were coming mattered to him. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I want you to understand something." She waited. "Whatever happens in that hearing, whatever Carver has built against you, whatever story this county has been told, I want you to know that I intend to say clearly, and on the public record, that every action you have taken in this house has been honest and deliberate, and has served people who had no one else serving them." The words landed with a weight she hadn't expected. She had spent 11 months being careful not to need anything from this house. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not protection. She had told herself she was here for Thomas, for the evidence for the truth. She had kept that boundary between herself and everything else so deliberately that she had almost stopped noticing it was a boundary at all. And now Nathaniel Reed was standing 3 feet away, facing her directly, with the exact expression of a man who meant every word he was saying, and the boundary was doing something she couldn't quite control. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of it. He nodded once. Then he turned back to the desk. "Read me the Dunmore filing again," he said. "I want to memorize the numbers before Thursday." Thursday came the way mornings come when everything matters unremarkably, with full daylight and birdsong, and the smell of summer heat already building before 8 o'clock, as though the world had no idea what was sitting in a courthouse 10 miles down the road, waiting to begin. Abigail dressed carefully. Not to impress, there was no impressing a room that had already decided against her. She dressed to be precise. Plain dress, good coat, hair pinned neatly. The appearance of a woman who was exactly what she claimed to be, nothing more, and nothing less. Nathaniel came down the stairs in a dark coat and good boots, and she thought without intending to that he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had been born to this land and had earned it twice over through grief and fever and the hard work of rebuilding a life his body had tried to take from him. Henry had the carriage ready. Abigail was about to step out the front door when she heard the sound of another carriage coming up the drive. She stopped. It was moving fast. Too fast for a social call. Too deliberate for a curiosity seeker. The horses were road-tired. She could hear it in the rhythm of the hooves, the particular uneven cadence of animals that had been traveling since before dawn. She turned back inside and said, "Nathaniel." He heard the change in her voice and came to the doorway. The carriage stopped in front of the house. The door opened. An older man stepped out, tall, white-haired, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had once been vigorous and had made peace with moving more carefully, but had not made peace with slowing down. He wore a dark coat and a Philadelphia solicitor's collar, and he carried a leather case under one arm. He looked up at the house. Then he looked at Nathaniel Reed. "Nathaniel," he said, "you look like your father." Nathaniel went very still. "Judge Monroe," he said. Elias Monroe climbed the front steps. He was 62 years old, and his face had the particular expression of a man who had received a letter, read it 3 times, sat with it overnight, and then decided that the train to Virginia was leaving in the morning, whether he was on it or not. He looked at Abigail. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "your brother wrote to me once in January of 1816. He said he had found something significant, and that if anything happened to him, I should look into the Reed estate accounts." He paused. "I am ashamed to tell you that I did not act on that letter as quickly as I should have." Abigail felt the floor shift slightly under her feet. Thomas had written to Monroe. Thomas had known enough to send a safety line to a federal judge, and Monroe had received it, and the system had moved too slowly, and Thomas had died in Harker's Creek before Monroe had acted. She breathed once carefully. "You're here now," she said. It came out steadier than she felt. Monroe held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded a short, decisive movement that felt like an apology and a commitment at the same time. "I am," he said, "and we have a hearing to attend." The courthouse in town was a 2-story brick building that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and by the time Nathaniel's carriage arrived, there were already people gathered outside it. Not a crowd exactly, but enough. Merchants, landowners, 2 men. Abigail recognized from the church congregation a woman in a blue dress who whispered something to the man beside her the moment she saw Nathaniel step down from the carriage. Word had traveled, the way word always traveled, in a county this size, fast, slightly distorted, and with the particular energy of people who had already decided what they believed and were here to watch it confirmed. Abigail stepped down behind Nathaniel and felt the weight of every set of eyes that shifted to her. She kept her chin level. Monroe descended last, and she watched the moment several people registered who he was, the slight double-take, the reassessment, the quiet recalibration of a room that had expected one kind of mourning and was now getting another. Hargrove was waiting on the courthouse steps. He was a compact, precise man in his 50s who had traveled from Richmond the previous evening and had spent the night at the inn 2 streets over. He shook Nathaniel's hand, nodded to Abigail, and then looked at Monroe with an expression that was professionally composed and personally relieved. "Judge Monroe," he said, "I wasn't certain you'd make it." "Neither was I," Monroe said. "Let's go in." The hearing room on the 2nd floor held about 40 people, and it was nearly full. Carver was already there, seated at the table on the left side of the room, flanked by 2 men. Abigail didn't recognize lawyers from Richmond. She guessed by the cut of their coats, and the settled confidence of men who had been hired specifically to be confident in rooms like this one. Carver himself looked composed. He had dressed for authority, dark coat, silver buttons, the particular presentation of a man who had appeared in courtrooms for 30 years and understood exactly what a room like this one responded to. He looked up when Nathaniel entered. Their eyes met, or Nathaniel's gaze moved in his direction, which from across the room amounted to the same thing. And for one moment, something moved across Carver's face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite calculation. It was the face of a man who had expected a problem and was now seeing that the problem was larger than anticipated. Then he saw Monroe. He went very still. Abigail watched it happen. The stillness, the rapid internal processing, the recovery. He recovered fast. She had to give him that. But the stillness had lasted just long enough. Judge Alderton entered from the side door and took his seat at the bench. He was a broad man in his 60s with a ruddy face and the manner of someone who had been told all his life that he was a reasonable man and had chosen to believe it. He looked at the room and then at Nathaniel's table and then at Monroe, and his expression did something complicated that he managed to smooth over before it became readable. We're here on the matter of a petition filed by Silas B. Carver regarding the competency and estate management of Nathaniel Hawthorne Reed, Alderton said. Mr. Carver, your petition. Carver's lead attorney rose. He was polished and deliberate, and he laid out the case with the unhurried confidence of someone who had walked into this room knowing the verdict and was simply fulfilling the procedural obligation of earning it. He spoke about the fever. He spoke about diminished capacity. He cited 3 instances manufactured Abigail knew, but specific enough to sound credible, in which Nathaniel had allegedly made decisions that estate managers and local merchants had found concerning. He spoke about the governess with careful, regretful language, never directly calling her a manipulator, but arranging the words in a shape that pointed in exactly that direction. He spoke for 14 minutes. When he sat down, Hargrove rose. Your Honor, we object to the framing of this petition on grounds that it was filed in direct response to Mr. Reed's discovery of fraudulent activity in the management of his own estate activity attributable to the petitioner himself. We will be presenting documentation supporting that position. Alderton's expression tightened very slightly. You'll have your opportunity, Mr. Hargrove. I appreciate that, Your Honor. I would also note for the record that Judge Elias Monroe of Philadelphia, formerly of the Federal Third Circuit, is present in this proceeding and has an established interest in its outcome. The room shifted. Not loudly, but audibly. Alderton looked at Monroe. Monroe looked back at him, with the particular expression of a man who had been on the bench long enough to recognize exactly what kind of judge was sitting across from him, and had decided not to pretend otherwise. Judge Monroe, Alderton said carefully, you are present in what capacity? Monroe rose. As a private citizen with a long-standing acquaintance with the Reed family and a recent correspondence with the estate's legal counsel. He paused. And as a man who received a letter in January of 1816 from a clerk named Thomas Whitaker, which letter I am prepared to submit to this proceeding as evidence of prior knowledge of the activities that have brought us here today. The room went quiet, not the polite quiet of a formal proceeding, the actual quiet of people who have just heard something they weren't expecting and are holding their breath. Carver's attorney leaned toward Carver and said something in a low voice. Carver did not respond. He was looking at Monroe. Alderton called a brief recess. Abigail used it to move close to Hargrove and say quietly, he's going to try to limit Monroe's participation. Find a procedural reason to exclude the letter. I know, Hargrove said, which is why I filed a motion this morning to enter it as exhibit before the hearing opened. It's already in the record. She looked at him. When did you? 7 o'clock this morning when the clerk's office opened. He straightened his coat. I've been in rooms like this before, Miss Whitaker. You file before they can object, or the objection becomes the story. She felt something that was almost gratitude and almost admiration in equal measure. There's something else, she said, and she told him about the Dunmore land, the assessed value, the sale price, the nephew's name, the county filing, she hadn't been able to access directly, but that Martha Caulfield's records cross-referenced precisely. Hargrove listened with his hands folded and his expression neutral. When she finished, he said, That's a criminal matter, not a civil one. I know. If I raise it in this proceeding, Alderton will say it's outside the scope of a competency hearing. But Monroe can raise it. A pause. Monroe is here as a private citizen. Monroe is a retired federal judge with standing to request a federal inquiry into county land fraud. He doesn't need this courtroom to do it. He only needs to say loudly enough for everyone in this room to hear that he intends to do it. Hargrove looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man reassessing who he was talking to. "I'll speak to him during the recess," he said. The recess lasted 12 minutes. When Alderton returned, his composure had settled into something harder and more careful. He had clearly spent those 12 minutes deciding how to manage Monroe's presence without triggering anything he couldn't control. He called Carver's first witness. The witness was a merchant named Aldous Finch, who ran the dry goods store on the main street. He was nervous and sweating slightly despite the morning not yet being hot, and he testified that on 2 separate occasions he had observed Mr. Reed appear confused about financial matters, once asking for a total to be repeated 3 times, and once seeming uncertain about a signed order. Hargrove cross-examined him with the patience of a man who had infinite time and intended to use it. "Mr. Finch, how long have you operated your store?" "Going on 16 years, sir." "And in 16 years have you ever had a customer ask for a total to be repeated?" A pause. "Well, yes, I suppose. Have you ever repeated a total for a customer who then completed the transaction correctly?" Yes. "And the signed order you mentioned, was it signed correctly?" "It was signed, yes." "Was there any error in the signature or the amount?" "No, but—" "Thank you, Mr. Finch." Finch stepped down, looking like a man who had just understood he'd been used for something he hadn't fully thought through. Carver's attorney called a second witness, a county road commissioner who testified about a land boundary dispute the previous year in which he claimed Nathaniel had been confused about the location of his own property line. Hargrove cross-examined him and established efficiently and without drama that the disputed boundary had also been contested by 2 other landowners and that the confusion had been universal, not specific to Nathaniel Reed. The second witness stepped down. Carver's attorney called a third witness. Abigail felt Nathaniel tense beside her before she heard the name. "Miss Clara Holt," the attorney said. Clara Holt was 26 years old and had been a housemaid at Reed Hall for 4 months the previous year before she'd left to marry a farmer outside of town. She was visibly uncomfortable, dressed in her best clothes, and she walked to the witness position without looking at Nathaniel. She testified that during her time at Reed Hall, she had observed the governess, Miss Whitaker, spending unusual amounts of time in the library with Mr. Reed in the evenings, handling documents that she did not believe were related to her educational duties, and speaking to Mr. Reed in a manner that Clara found she searched for the word familiar. The word fell into the room with exactly the weight Carver had intended it to have. Abigail kept her hands still in her lap. Nathaniel's jaw tightened once, and then he deliberated, relaxed it. Hargrove rose. "Miss Holt, when you say the manner was familiar, can you describe specifically what you observed?" She spoke to him directly, without being spoken to first sometimes. "Is that unusual in a working household?" "For a governess with the master of the house." "Were the conversations you observed private or conducted in the presence of others?" Clara hesitated. "In the presence of Henry sometimes, or the household staff passing through." "So these conversations you found concerning were conducted openly in shared spaces with other staff present?" Yes. "And did you ever observe any action that was improper in a legal sense? Any document handled without permission? Any order countermanded? Any?" "No, but the manner." "Thank you, Miss Holt." Clara Holt stepped down. The room had a particular tension to it now. Not the tension of a case going one direction, but the tension of a room that couldn't quite find its footing, that had expected a simple story, and was getting something more complicated. Alderton called a recess for midday. In the hallway, Carver crossed the room and stopped 6 feet from Nathaniel. He didn't speak to Hargrove. He didn't acknowledge Monroe. He looked directly at Nathaniel, or in Nathaniel's direction, knowing that Nathaniel could perceive him well enough to know he was being addressed. "I want you to think carefully," Carver said quietly, without the performance he'd been using in the courtroom. This was the real voice. Abigail had heard it once before in the library, in the moment after she'd stopped the pen, and she recognized it now, the voice of a man who has stopped pretending. I have managed this estate for 30 years. I managed it through your father's illness, and through your fever, and through 2 years of you being limited in ways you don't like to acknowledge. I kept this estate running, and now you're going to destroy that because a girl from Pennsylvania with a grievance has convinced you I'm the villain. Nathaniel stood completely still. She didn't convince me of anything, he said. Your own document did. That document was a drafting error. You said that once, in my library. I didn't believe it then. His voice was quiet and absolute. I don't believe it now. Carver looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that might in another man have been the beginning of genuine remorse. But it didn't complete itself. It stopped halfway and hardened into something else. You're going to regret this, Carver said. I already regret a great many things, Nathaniel said. Most of them involve trusting you. Carver turned and walked away. Abigail stood beside Nathaniel and let the silence settle for a moment. You all right? She asked. Yes. A pause. No. A shorter pause. Ask me again after this afternoon. The afternoon session began with Hargrove presenting the defense. He was methodical and precise. He entered Thomas's copied ledger pages. He entered Martha Caulfield's husband's complaint records. He entered the billing discrepancy cross-reference Abigail had built over 3 days. Entry by entry, date by date, the double charges laid out in a table so clear that even a hostile judge would have had to work hard to misread it. Alderton tried twice to limit the scope of the evidence, citing procedural grounds. Monroe, from his seat in the gallery, spoke once quietly with the weight of someone who had spent 40 years making rooms, listened to him, and said that limiting evidence in a competency hearing that had itself been filed in apparent bad faith would constitute a procedural irregularity, he would note formally for the federal record. Alderton did not limit the evidence again. Then Hargrove called Martha Caulfield. She walked to the witness position with the steady walk of a woman who had been waiting 7 years to sit in exactly this chair, and she testified with the careful precision of someone who had been over the facts so many times in her own mind that they had become as smooth and solid as river stones. She described her husband's complaints. She described the response he had received. She named the county official who had told him to drop it, a man who had died the previous winter, which meant his name could be spoken without consequence and without contradiction. She described the Dunmore land assessment and the sale price discrepancy. She described her husband coming home from the courthouse the 3rd time, sitting at the kitchen table and saying very quietly that he didn't think there was anything more he could do about it through proper channels, and that he hoped someone else would find the right channel eventually. When she said that the room was completely silent, Carver's attorney chose not to cross-examine Martha Caulfield. That decision told the room something. Then came the moment nobody had planned. Hargrove had not called Abigail as a witness. They had decided together the previous evening that putting her on the stand gave Carver's attorney the opportunity to make the hearing about her, her motives, her background, her relationship to the case, rather than about the evidence. Better to let the documents speak. But Carver's attorney called her. She walked to the witness position and sat down and looked directly at the man across the room, who had her brother's ledger pages hidden somewhere, and who had been the last powerful person Thomas had trusted before he died. Miss Whitaker, the attorney said, you came to Reed Hall in August of last year. Yes. You represented yourself as a governess seeking employment. I am a governess. I was seeking employment. Both of those things were true. But you also came with a personal agenda. I came with a personal purpose, yes. And that purpose was to investigate Mr. Carver. My purpose was to determine what had happened to my brother and to protect the people whose interests he had died trying to protect. Your brother Thomas Whitaker was a clerk who worked for Mr. Carver. Yes? And you believe Mr. Carver was responsible for his death. I believe that Thomas discovered fraud, that the people who stood to lose from that discovery knew he had discovered it, and that he died 6 weeks after writing to me about it." She paused. "I'll let the court draw its own conclusion." "That's not an answer." "It is an answer," she said. "It's just not the answer you wanted." A pause. The attorney shifted his approach. "You spent 11 months in Mr. Reed's household gaining his trust before revealing your true intentions. I spent 11 months building a case before I had enough evidence to act on it. Presenting accusations without evidence would have accomplished nothing except getting me removed from the house before I could help anyone. And during those 11 months, you had extensive private access to a blind man who, Mr. Reed is not blind." Her voice came out clean and flat. "He has partial vision loss from a fever. He reads through other people, manages a significant estate, maintains detailed knowledge of his properties and accounts, and makes decisions with considerably more rigor than most men I have encountered who have full sight. Referring to him as simply blind is both inaccurate and irrelevant." The room was very quiet. From the corner of her vision, she saw Nathaniel's head come up slightly. The attorney paused for a moment, recalibrating. "You developed a personal attachment to Mr. Reed during your time in his household." "I developed respect for Mr. Reed during my time in his household, which is what happens when you work closely with someone who turns out to be exactly who they claim to be. Miss Whitaker, I would also note," she said, "that you have been in this courtroom for 3 hours attempting to establish that Nathaniel Reed is incapable of managing his own affairs, while simultaneously arguing that he was so easily managed by me that I controlled his decisions for 11 months. Those two arguments contradict each other. He cannot be both incapable and manipulated. One implies he lacks judgment, the other implies someone was working very hard to override it. You need to decide which case you're making." The attorney looked at her. Alderton looked at her. The room looked at her. She sat very still and looked back. "No further questions," the attorney said. Hargrove called Nathaniel last. He walked to the witness position without assistance, and Abigail watched him do it and felt something in her chest that she had been carefully managing for 2 weeks, and that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. He sat. He faced the room. His posture was the posture of a man who was done apologizing for anything not aggressive, not defensive, just occupying his own space with a clarity that needed no help from anyone. Hargrove asked him straightforward questions. When had he inherited Reed Hall? What had his father's intentions been for the estate? What was his understanding of his own medical condition and its impact on his capacity to manage his affairs? Nathaniel answered all of it precisely and without drama. Then Hargrove asked, "In your own assessment, Mr. Reed, what was the most significant threat to this estate over the past 2 years?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "The most significant threat," he said, "was my own willingness to trust a man because my father had trusted him without asking the questions I should have asked myself." He paused. "I lost much of my sight to fever. But I lost far more by letting someone else tell me what was true about my own home and my own people." The room was completely still. "When Miss Whitaker stopped my pen," he continued, "she did not manipulate me. She gave me back the one thing Silas Carver had spent 2 years taking from me. She gave me the chance to see clearly." He paused. "I do not believe there is a medical definition for what she restored, but I am quite certain it was not the action of someone working against my interests." Carver's attorney did not cross-examine. The verdict should have come that afternoon. It didn't. Alderton called a recess and retreated to his chambers, and the afternoon stretched into early evening while the people in the courthouse hall waited and murmured and shifted from foot to foot. Abigail sat beside Nathaniel on a bench in the hallway and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and he sat beside her with his hands on his knees and said nothing for the same reason. After a while he said quietly, "Whatever he decides." "Don't," she said. A pause. "Don't what?" Don't prepare me for a bad outcome. I've been preparing for bad outcomes for 2 years. I'm tired of it. Another pause. All right, he said. Monroe came and stood nearby, not sitting, not speaking, just present in the particular way of a man who has been in enough courtrooms to know that presence is sometimes the only thing that matters. At 5:15, the clerk came out and said Judge Alderton was ready. The room filled back up quickly. Alderton took his seat. He looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked very briefly at Monroe. Then he said, "This court finds insufficient grounds to support the petition as filed. The evidence presented by the respondent raises serious questions about the conduct of the petitioner that this court is not in a position to adjudicate within the scope of a competency hearing. The petition is dismissed." He paused. "Furthermore, this court is referring the billing discrepancy documentation and the Dunmore land transfer evidence to the county solicitor's office for independent review." A murmur went through the room. Carver sat at his table and did not move. His attorneys leaned toward him. He did not respond to them. Alderton continued. "With respect to any further proceedings, this court notes the presence of Judge Monroe and will cooperate fully with any federal inquiry that may arise from today's evidence." He set down his papers. "We're adjourned." Tiens, the room erupted into noise and movement, and in the middle of it, Abigail sat very still for one moment, just one, and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than both the particular feeling of having done something that needed doing for a long time and having it finally be over and realizing that the thing you were carrying was heavier than you'd let yourself admit while you were carrying it. She thought about Thomas, briefly, quietly, the way she thought about him every day, but had learned to do quickly in the space of a single breath, so it didn't stop her from moving forward. Then Nathaniel was beside her, and he said very quietly, "Miss Whitaker." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Nothing elaborated. She looked at him, the man who had stood in that witness position and said in front of a full courtroom that she had given him back his sight. And she felt the boundary she had been maintaining since August of last year shift in a way she couldn't quite put back in order. "You did the hard part," she said. "We did the hard part," he said. Monroe appeared at Nathaniel's shoulder. "I need to speak with Hargrove about the federal referral. There are steps that need to happen in the next 48 hours if we're going to ensure the county solicitor doesn't bury the Dunmore evidence before it reaches a federal docket." He looked at Nathaniel. "Your father would be proud of you." Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. "Tell me that again," he said quietly. "When Carver is actually in front of a federal judge." Monroe almost smiled. "Fair enough." Carver left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Abigail watched him go through the window, the measured walk, the leather satchel, the silver hair. A man receding. Not broken, not yet, but smaller than he had been that morning. Behind her, Gus Holloway and 2 other tenant farmers had pushed their way through the crowd, and one of them, a man she didn't know by name, had taken Nathaniel's hand and was shaking it and saying something in a low, steady voice, and Nathaniel was listening with the focused stillness she had come to recognize as his version of being moved. She turned back to the window. The investigation into Thomas's death was not settled. The Dunmore land was not returned. The federal inquiry had not yet begun. There were months of work still ahead, and Carver was not the kind of man who accepted a loss without engineering a countermove. She knew all of that, but outside the window, the summer evening was doing what Virginia summer evenings do, going golden and slow, the light going soft over the hills. And for the first time in 2 years, Abigail Whitaker let herself stand in a moment without calculating what came next. Just for a moment. Then Nathaniel called her name, and she turned back, and they walked out of the courthouse together into the last light of the afternoon. The carriage ride back to Reed Hall was quiet, in the way that comes after something large has passed through, not empty, but full of things that hadn't found their words yet. Monroe rode with them. He sat across from Nathaniel and Abigail, and spent most of the ride looking out the window with his hands folded on his knee, the expression of a man reviewing a long list of things he wished he had done differently and accepting that the list was what it was. Halfway home, he said without looking away from the window, "I should have acted on Thomas's letter immediately." Nobody responded right away. Then Abigail said, "Yes, you should have." Monroe turned and looked at her. She met his eyes directly. She wasn't going to soften it for him. He was a federal judge. He could carry the weight of a true thing. He nodded once. "I intend to carry that," he said, "for whatever it's worth to you." "What it's worth to me," she said, "is that you're here now and the work isn't finished. The Dunmore land, the investigation into Thomas's death, the federal inquiry into the billing fraud." She paused. "Those things need to happen, Judge Monroe, not as a favor, as what's owed." "Agreed," he said. "Completely." Nathaniel had been quiet through the exchange, but she felt him listening with his whole body, the way he always did, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was taking in every word and building something from it. When Monroe finished speaking, Nathaniel said, "How long will it take to get the federal referral on a formal docket?" "If Hargrove files the motion this week, and I provide a supporting affidavit, 4 to 6 weeks for a response. The Dunmore transfer is the strongest piece. Land fraud involving forged sale prices and shell companies is a federal matter when it crosses county lines, and Carver's nephew's company is registered in Richmond. And Alderton." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "Alderton is going to have an uncomfortable few months. He didn't rule in Carver's favor today, which means he's not fully committed to protecting him. But he knew about Carver. The referral he made to the county solicitor was the minimum he could do with Monroe in the room. It was self-preservation, not justice." He paused. "I'll be watching what the county solicitor does with that referral very carefully." "As will I," Nathaniel said. The carriage turned up the Reed Hall Drive, and the house came into view against the last color in the evening sky, and Abigail looked at it and felt for the first time since she'd arrived 11 months ago that it looked like what it was supposed to be. Not a place where something was hidden. Not a place where a wrong was waiting to be righted. Just a house, solid and white and old on its hill above the fields belonging to the man sitting beside her. Monroe stayed 3 days. In those 3 days, he and Hargrove and Nathaniel worked through every document Abigail had compiled, the copied ledger pages, Martha Colefield's records, the billing discrepancy, cross-referenced the Dunmore transfer and the father's final letter, and built from them a formal submission to the federal court in Richmond. Abigail read aloud. Nathaniel remembered. Monroe organized. Hargrove drafted. By the second evening, they had something that was no longer a stack of evidence and had become a case coherent sourced, sequenced, the kind of document that didn't ask a judge to believe anything, but simply showed him what the numbers said and let the numbers do the work. On the second night after Monroe and Hargrove had retired, Nathaniel and Abigail were left in the library in the particular silence that had become familiar to them over the past weeks. The working silence, the thinking silence, the silence that wasn't absence of communication, but a different form of it. She was sorting pages. He was at the desk, both hands flat on the surface, facing no particular direction, which she now understood meant he was simply thinking. "She said something to me," he said. Abigail looked up. "Who?" "Martha Colefield. When I went to thank her this afternoon. She took my hand and she said..." He paused. "She said your father would have gotten in that carriage and driven to Richmond himself." Abigail set down the pages. "She meant it as a compliment," he said. "I know, but I heard something else in it. The thing I've been carrying since the fever." He was quiet for a moment. "My father could see. He could go anywhere, do anything, appear before any judge, and be seen as a man in full possession of himself. And I..." He stopped. "I have been managing this estate from inside these walls for 2 years because I was afraid. Not of incompetence, of being seen as incompetent, of giving anyone the opportunity to look at me and see limitation instead of the man." Abigail was very still. "Carver used that," he said. "He used the exact thing I was trying to hide. He built a world around me where I couldn't see what was happening because I was too busy trying to look like I could see everything." Yes, she said quietly. And then you walked in, he said. And you didn't manage me. You didn't compensate for me. You just told me the truth and handed me the evidence and expected me to act on it. I did expect that. I know. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, just the slow movement of something settling into its right place. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what I couldn't have told you before today. He turned toward her. You treated me like a man who was capable of handling the truth. And it had been long enough since someone had done that I had almost forgotten what it felt like. The room was very quiet. Abigail put both hands flat on the papers in front of her, a gesture she hadn't noticed she'd borrowed from him until this exact moment. Thomas did that, she said. He told hard truths to people who needed to hear them. It got him killed. She paused. I decided a long time ago that the least I could do was keep doing it in his name. Nathaniel said, It's yours now, not just his. She looked at him. The courage, he said. It's yours. Not a tribute, not a memorial. Yours. She didn't trust herself to respond to that immediately, so she picked up the pages again and said, We should finish the third section before morning. And he turned back to the desk and said, Read me the Dunmore entry again. And they worked until the candles were low and the summer night had gone fully dark outside the windows. Monroe left on Friday morning. He shook Nathaniel's hand on the front steps and said he would send word the moment the federal submission was acknowledged. He turned to Abigail last, and he held her hand in both of his for a moment, and he said, Your brother was right to trust that someone would eventually come looking. I'm sorry it took this long to be that person. She said, Do the work, Judge Monroe. That's all? He nodded. I will. His carriage went down the drive, and the sound of it faded, and Abigail stood on the front steps of Reed Hall in the Friday morning and thought about what came next. What came next was the question she had been avoiding for 2 weeks, the one she had been able to defer as long as there was a hearing to prepare for a case to build an immediate task that needed doing more urgently than the question of what she was doing here once the immediate tasks were done. Her purpose had been Thomas. Then it had been the evidence. Then the hearing. The hearing was over. She went back inside. Dead. She found Nathaniel in the library, where else, and told him she thought she should begin thinking about her next employment placement. She said it carefully in the neutral tone of a practical woman discussing a practical matter, and she watched his face to see how he received it. He received it badly. He didn't show it dramatically. He went still in the way he went still when something had surprised him that he hadn't expected to be surprised by, and then he turned toward the window, and then he said in a voice that was working harder than usual to be even, Is that what you want? I think it's what makes sense, she said. That's not what I asked. A pause. Nathaniel, you've been here 11 months, he said. You built a case that most men with full resources and full sight couldn't have built. You walked into a courthouse in a county where no one knew your name and made them listen. You gave this estate back to itself. He turned back toward her. And now you're talking about placement. I'm a governess, she said. That's what I do. But you're not. He stopped, tried again. You are not a governess the way a hammer is a hammer. What you are is considerably more than your current employment category. Despite everything, something moved through her chest that felt uncomfortably close to wanting to smile. Is that a compliment, Mr. Reed? It's a statement of fact. He moved away from the window. I told you I wanted to offer you a formal position, estate secretary, legal archivist. I meant it. I still mean it. I know you meant it. Then why are we discussing placement? She was quiet for a moment, arranging the honest answer, which was harder to say than the practical one. Because I don't want to stay somewhere I'm kept, she said finally. I've spent enough of my life being careful not to need things. I'm not going to start needing this house. He was completely still. Abby? He used her name. Her first name. The short version, the one nobody in this house had ever used. It came out without apparent calculation, and she heard him register it a half second after he'd said it, the slight pause, the decision not to take it back. She looked at him. "I'm not offering you a place to be kept," he said. "I'm offering you a place to be known." The sentence arrived without warning and landed somewhere deep in the part of her that had been careful and quiet and boundaried for 2 years, and that was now without her full permission coming undone. "That's not a fair thing to say," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's true." She turned away, walked to the bookshelf, which was the wrong direction for anywhere, but she needed a moment that wasn't his face. "You don't know me well enough. I know you read ledgers in the dark before the household woke up. I know you keep your brother's letters in an oilskin pouch sewn into your travel bag, because you can't bring yourself to put them somewhere safer, but you can't lose them. I know you borrowed my habit of keeping both hands flat on the desk when you're thinking, which you're doing right now and haven't noticed." He paused. "I know you told Martha Caulfield she was brave without making her feel like she needed to be thanked for it. I know you got angry exactly twice, once in the courtroom when the attorney called me blind, and once here in this room when I used the phrase, 'whatever happens at the hearing,' and both times you were angry not for yourself but for someone else." She kept her hands flat on the bookshelf and did not move. "I know that the courage you carry," he said, "isn't something you perform. It's something you're constituted of. And I have been in the presence of it for 2 weeks, and I—" He stopped, and then very quietly, "I don't want you to leave." The room was completely still. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the library, not at the desk, not by the window, just in the open middle of the room, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not uncertain exactly. Nathaniel Reed was rarely uncertain, but open. The careful composure entirely set aside the way you set something down when you've decided to stop pretending it isn't heavy. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I was never particularly good at it, and the fever didn't improve my social graces. But I'm asking you to stay. Not for the estate. Not for the legal work, though God knows I need someone who can read. For—" He paused. "For the evenings in this library. For the particular kind of silence we have when we're working. For the fact that this house is different when you're in it." Abigail walked back across the room until she was standing in front of him. She looked at his face. This man who had stood in a courtroom and told the truth about what she'd given him, who had listened to her read evidence for 2 weeks and remembered every number, who had said we did the hard part when he could have said I and meant it differently. "I'm not staying because you asked me to," she said. "I know. I'm staying because this work isn't finished and I intend to see it through." "I know that too. And because," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, "the evenings in this library are different for me as well." He didn't move. Neither did she. But something between them settled not into conclusion, not into anything that needed a name yet, but into the beginning of something that had been building for 2 weeks through ledger pages and courthouse testimony and late nights, and the particular trust that comes from standing in the same hard place together and not flinching. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived from Monroe. The federal submission had been accepted. A Richmond judge had agreed to hear the land fraud case. The Dunmore transfer, the assessed value, the shell company, the nephew's name had been flagged as the primary exhibit. 2 additional county land transfers were under investigation. Carver's accounts in Richmond were frozen pending review. And at the bottom of the letter, added in Monroe's own handwriting rather than the formal typed text, a single additional line. "The inquiry into Thomas Whitaker's death has been formally reopened. A federal marshal has been assigned." Abigail read that line 3 times. Then she folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment. Nathaniel was at the desk. He heard the particular quality of the silence and said, "Read it to me." She read the whole letter. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Thomas," he said. Just the name, quietly. "Yes," she said. She set the letter on the desk. Outside the library windows, it was a July morning, and the fields were at full summer, and the sound of the tenant farmers working came through faintly the way it always did, steady and ordinary and belonging. Gus Holloway had been by the previous week. He had come to return a borrowed tool and had ended up staying an hour. And at the end of the hour, he had said to no one in particular, and to both of them at once, that folks on the South Farms were sleeping better than they had in a while, knowing the lease agreements were back where they belonged. He hadn't elaborated. He hadn't needed to. The twist nobody had anticipated came in September. Carver's nephew, the man whose name was on the Richmond Shell Company, whose signature appeared on the Dunmore purchase, turned himself in. He walked into the federal marshal's office in Richmond on a Tuesday morning unannounced with his own attorney and a box of documents, and he said that he had been used by his uncle without his full understanding of what the transactions involved, and that he wished to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for consideration. The box of documents he brought included Thomas Whitaker's original ledger pages. Abigail heard about it from Hargrove, who rode out to Reed Hall specifically to tell her in person. She sat in the library and held the letter Hargrove had given her and read the line about the ledger pages, and felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed since February of 1816. Thomas's handwriting. In a federal marshal's evidence box, about to become the document that brought down the man who had ordered his death. "Are you all right?" Hargrove asked. "No," she said, "but I will be." He nodded and left her to it. Nathaniel came in 20 minutes later. He didn't announce himself. He simply came and sat in the chair across from her and was present in the particular way he was present, fully without performance, without the impulse to fix what didn't need fixing. After a while she said, "He did it. Thomas did it. It was his ledger that—" She stopped. "I know," Nathaniel said. "He died trying to do exactly this, and it worked, and he'll never—" She stopped again. "He'll never know," Nathaniel said. "No, he won't." He paused. "But you know, and you finished it. And the people whose land was stolen are getting it back, and a federal marshal is investigating his death." A pause. "That's not nothing, Abby. That's everything he was trying to do." She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way you do when you're trying to keep something in, and then she let it go and cried quietly for about 2 minutes, and Nathaniel sat across from her and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," he said. "I'm not usually—" "I know. Don't apologize." She took a slow breath. And then, because it was true, and she was done being careful with true things, she said, "I don't know what I would have done without you, these past months." He was quiet for a moment. "Managed perfectly well, I expect," he said. "You had managed for a long time before I appeared in your plans." A pause. "But I'm glad I was here." "So am I," she said. Carver was arrested in October, not quietly, not privately. The federal marshal came to his house on a Thursday morning with 2 deputies and a warrant, and half the county saw it happen because half the county had been watching for it since the hearing in July, and the kind of story that moves fast in a county this size moved fastest when it was finally over. Abigail heard about it from Henry, who had heard it from his brother, who had heard it from the freight driver, who had been on that road at the right time. She was in the library when Henry told her, sorting through the new estate records she had reorganized over the past month. The real ones, the accurate ones, the ones that reflected what was actually in the ground and what it was actually worth. Henry delivered the news and then stood in the doorway for a moment. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. "Thank you, Henry," she said. He nodded and started to leave. Then he stopped and turned back and he said, "Miss Whitaker, for what it's worth from the staff, I mean all of us, we're glad you grabbed his wrist." She looked up at him. "That morning," he said, "in this room, we're all glad you did it." He left before she could respond. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to the records. In November, the Dunmore land was formally returned to the Reed estate. The county record was corrected, the Shell Company dissolved, and the tenant families, who had been paying Carver's nephew's company, were given back 3 years of overpayment. Not from Nathaniel, who could have claimed the debt, but from Carver's seized accounts, which was the right source, and the only one that carried any real meaning. Gus Holloway came to the house the day the corrected lease documents were signed. He came with his eldest son, and he stood in the library, the same library where none of this would have ended differently if one woman hadn't crossed the room on a July morning, and he shook Nathaniel's hand for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked at Abigail. "Ma'am," he said, which was all. Which was enough. The new document was signed on a Thursday afternoon in December. It was Nathaniel's idea, and he had asked Hargrove to draft it, and when Hargrove had delivered it the previous week, Nathaniel had asked Abigail to read it through twice and tell him if anything was missing. Nothing was missing. It was a legal foundation, a formal charter establishing a tenant protection fund for the Reed estate, making it legally impossible for any future owner, administrator, or legal representative to transfer tenant land rights without the written agreement of a 2/3 majority of farming families holding active leases. It named the fund after no one, which had been Nathaniel's choice and which Abigail thought was exactly right. The library was warm. Henry had built the fire up. Outside December had settled over Virginia the way December did, gray and cold, and quiet the fields, bare the creek, probably ice-edged by now. Nathaniel sat at his father's desk. Hargrove had the document. Abigail stood to Nathaniel's right, which had become her position in this room. The natural position, the one that had stopped feeling like a choice some weeks ago, and started feeling like where she simply was. "Read me the final clause," Nathaniel said. She took the document from Hargrove and found the last paragraph and read it aloud, the formal language of protection, the legal structure of permanence, the names of the witnesses and the date, and the statement of intent that her voice carried through the quiet room and into the December afternoon. When she finished, Nathaniel took the pen. He held it for a moment. "My father signed things at this desk his whole life," he said, "not to the room, just to himself or to her or to the heir that had been present for all of it. Most of them I'll never know about, but I think he would have liked this one." He signed. The pen went down. Hargrove collected the document. Henry witnessed it. The thing was done, and Nathaniel Reed set both hands flat on his father's desk and turned toward the woman who had walked into his library with his pen in her fist and the truth already in her hand. The woman who had given him back his sight when he didn't know he'd lost it. The woman whose brother's name was about to appear in a federal court record as the man who had started it all. "Same sunlight," he said quietly. She looked at the light coming through the east windows, the same angle, the same room, where a morning in July had changed everything. "Different morning," she said. He smiled. A full one this time. Not the fragment she had seen in the library weeks ago, but the complete thing, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought she would remember exactly this: the desk, the light, the signed paper, and that smile for the rest of her life without trying. "Abby," he said. "Yes?" "Stay." She had already stayed. She had been staying by degrees and by choice, and by the accumulation of everything that had passed between them in this room and in courtrooms, and in the dark of early mornings when the house was quiet and the truth needed reading, and he had been the one listening. But he was asking again. Not for the estate, not for the work, just for her. She looked at him. This man who had stood at this desk in July and nearly lost everything, who had chosen truth when it cost him something, who had been seen fully in a courtroom and had not flinched, who had never once asked her to be less than exactly what she was. "I'm already here," she said. And she was. The person nobody had seen had walked into this house and seen everything, and had made them see it too, and had stood in the light of a December afternoon in the library of a man who finally understood that the clearest sight he had ever had was not the sight he'd lost to fever, but the sight he'd gained on a July morning when a governess tore a pen from his hand and told him the truth. That was where the story ended. Not with a question, not with a door left open, but with a woman standing exactly where she had chosen to stand, and a man who had finally learned to see her, and a piece of paper on the desk that would protect people who might never know her name. The truth had found its way home, and so had she.